I was 40-something when my daughter got pregnant at 19, old enough to have weathered life, but not old enough to be ready for the kind of storm that rearranges the coastline of a family forever. I remember the morning she told us. My husband and I were standing in the kitchen, sunlight hitting our daughter's face just enough for me to see the tremble in her mouth. She wasn't irresponsible. She wasn't reckless. She was just young and terrified. Her boyfriend stood beside her, pale and sweating, and I felt something inside me shift. Some ancient maternal instinct that whispered, protect her, protect the child, protect the truth of who you raised her to be. But families don't always follow the same instinct. Not mine, anyway. When she told my mother-in-law, I watched a woman who had held my babies, blessed our home, prayed over our meals, transform. I still don't know what she saw in my daughter in that moment, but it wasn't compassion. It was opportunity. She pulled my daughter toward crisis pregnancy counseling, talking about responsibility and shame in the same breath. I told my girl, if you want to keep this baby, you keep your baby. If you want adoption, I'll adopt her myself. That was my promise. But promises mean nothing when the louder people in your family have already built a plan in the shadows. My sister-in-law, my husband's brother's wife, suddenly felt called to adopt. My mother-in-law celebrated the idea like it was the second coming of royalty. And my daughter, God, my sweet girl, she folded under the pressure. Not because she was weak, but because she thought disappointing them would make her unworthy of love. She didn't know she was about to learn the hardest truth of adulthood. Some people only love you when you're convenient. As her pregnancy progressed, I started to notice the subtle cues. My mother-in-law's obsession with the baby, her absence of empathy for my daughter, the way she kept slipping in comments about readiness and responsibility. But I didn't see the full picture yet. I didn't see the way betrayal was threading itself through the walls of our family home, quiet and confident, like it already knew how the story would end. What I did know was that my daughter was exhausted, anxious, and suddenly very alone. She kept saying, "Mom, I don't want to let anyone down." I told her, "You are not here to perform for anybody's comfort." But when a 19-year-old is surrounded by adults who think they know better, my voice was just one among many, and mine wasn't the harshest. My mother-in-law wanted my daughter to invite her into the delivery room. She positioned herself like she was the baby's rightful owner. She planned nursery colors before my daughter even had her hospital bag packed. My daughter thought her grandmother would protect her if she changed her mind. She couldn't have been more wrong. By the time labor hit, I didn't know we were standing at the edge of a cliff, but I felt the ground softening. Her labor lasted almost 24 hours. My girl shook, cried, fought through the contractions, and somewhere around hour 23, her heartbeat dipped and the doctor decided on a C-section. I held her hand as they wheeled her into the OR. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Mom, what if I made a mistake?" I stroked her hair and said, "Then we'll fix it, together." I meant it. I meant every syllable. She didn't know the decision had already been made for her. Because while I was focused on her survival, my mother-in-law was focused on her son's prize. I felt it. Something cold behind me, watching. Something calculating. Then I heard my granddaughter's first cry, and the world froze. She was so tiny, so perfect, a little miracle wrapped in white. I cried, not from shock, not from fear, not from grief. I cried because I loved her instantly, completely, the way only a mother and grandmother can. And yet, even in that moment, a part of me recognized the shift in the room. My mother-in-law didn't cry.
She stared, claiming, possessing. It felt like a warning I didn't understand yet. My brother-in-law and his wife arrived the next day, smiling too hard, touching too freely, speaking like they were already her parents. They weren't waiting for permission. They were waiting for paperwork. And then the first wound appeared. They corrected my youngest daughter for calling me grandma. They told her, no, she won't be calling them that. Them, as if we were strangers, as if we hadn't built this family together for decades. My husband and I confronted them gently, trying not to ignite a war. They pretended to understand, pretended to agree, pretended to be reasonable. But by then, the theft was already halfway complete. And I didn't know it yet, but my mother-in-law, the woman who raised my husband, was about to do something that would fracture our family for the rest of our lives. Something that would turn a newborn's cries into the opening notes of a tragedy. Something that would teach me that sometimes the people who hold your bloodline also hold the knife.
No one prepares you for what it feels like to watch your child become the enemy in her own story. Not because she did anything wrong, but because somebody else found it convenient to paint her that way. In the days after the birth, something shifted in the hospital. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It moved quietly, the way a shadow moves when the sun slips behind a building. One moment, everything feels normal, and the next, everything is colder. My mother-in-law stopped speaking to my daughter like she was the mother of her own child. She spoke to her like she was a problem delaying someone else's future. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Exhaustion, hormones, fear. But then I witnessed the moment that snapped the last thread of illusion. My daughter was slowly walking around the maternity floor at the nurse's insistence. A C-section means movement is necessary if you want to avoid complications. Her steps were unsteady, painful, but she was trying. My mother-in-law cornered her in the hallway. I only heard pieces, sharp, clipped words, delivered in that familiar tone she used when she wanted to humiliate someone without appearing openly cruel. You should be ashamed. You aren't ready to be a mother. Stop pretending you know what's best for that baby. I stepped out of the room in time to see my daughter freeze, her face draining of color. Her hands shook against the railing. She looked like a woman being pushed off a cliff while everyone else applauded the view. I demanded to know what was going on. My mother-in-law didn't flinch. She looked straight in my face and said, "She needs to understand reality. That baby belongs with responsible adults." Responsible adults. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about support. This was about possession, about control, about rewriting motherhood in a way that excluded my daughter entirely. And she was doing it shamelessly. My daughter cried for hours after that. Not the dramatic kind of crying, but the quiet, silent kind that a mother hears even when there's no sound. The kind that tears something inside you. She said, "Mom, maybe she's right. Maybe keeping her would be selfish." And I wanted to scream, not at her, at the people who convinced a 19-year-old girl that wanting her own child was selfish. But my daughter was drowning in guilt, pressure, and the fear of disappointing everyone she'd grown up trying to make proud. She had no idea pride doesn't exist in people who only love you when you behave according to the script they wrote. 4 days after my granddaughter was born, they brought in the paperwork. The voluntary termination of parental rights. Voluntary. The cruelest word in that sentence. My daughter's hands shook as she signed. I held her shoulders. My husband held her hand.
She kept whispering, "I don't know if this is right. I don't know if this is right." But the room was full of people pushing her toward only one answer. She believed she was choosing peace. She didn't know she was choosing exile. As soon as the final page was signed, my mother-in-law relaxed, actually relaxed, for the first time since the baby was born. My brother-in-law and his wife were already smiling, already planning, already acting like the paperwork erased biology. But what nobody prepared for was the regret. It hit my daughter like a truck. Less than a week later, she called her uncle crying, begging, pleading. She told him she made a mistake. She asked for her baby back. He refused. Coldly, formally, like she was a stranger. She wasn't asking for a favor. She was asking for her child. He answered with legal language as if she were a threat, not family. That was the moment I knew we needed help. We contacted lawyers. We learned the truth of the law in Illinois. Her signature was irreversible unless we could prove fraud or coercion, but the only way to do that was to accuse my mother-in-law of acting as their agent. My husband hesitated, not because he doubted our daughter, but because accusing his own mother felt like tearing out the foundation of his childhood home. The lawyers told us to let things settle, that we'd eventually be part of our granddaughter's life. They were wrong. Dangerously wrong. My brother-in-law and his wife declared my daughter not a part of their family after she confronted them. They weaponized her grief, labeled her unstable, unreasonable, dramatic, every word used against women when they dare to fight for something that was rightfully theirs. She wasn't allowed to see her daughter again until the baby's first birthday. And even then, it wasn't freely given. She had to ask. She had to pay. She had to travel. She had to behave exactly the way they wanted her to, or they would shut the door again. 5 visits. That's all she's had in 5 years. Every single one costing hundreds in plane tickets, hotel fees, rental cars, because visiting her own child required a financial sacrifice that none of them cared about. And me, my husband, our other children, we have never seen her. Not once. Not even in a photograph taken with generosity or love. We send gifts, cards, letters, toys, books, clothes. We've been told she never receives any of it. And what hurts the most is not the rejection, it's the silence. The absolute refusal of my husband's family to acknowledge the devastation they caused. My mother-in-law says we're liars. My father-in-law agrees with her. They pretend we abandoned them when they were the ones who burned the bridge. 5 years of grief. 5 years of counseling. 5 years of trying to rebuild something inside ourselves that won't stop collapsing. And I keep coming back to the same truth. Some betrayals don't kill you. They just carve out a part of you that never grows back.
Grief is a strange, disobedient thing. People think it only belongs to death. Funerals, caskets, flowers you never wanted to smell. But the truth is, the cruelest grief comes when the person you lost is still out there, breathing, laughing, growing, and you're forced to live like they're a ghost. That's what the first 5 years felt like, a ghost story. Except the ghosts were the living ones, and we were the ones left wandering the ruins. The first year, the year of waiting for a door that never opened. After that first birthday visit, the only one my daughter was allowed, we waited.
We tried to be patient, reasonable, diplomatic. We tried to believe the lawyers who said, time will help. We tried to believe that family, even complicated family, would not deny us forever. Every holiday, I held my breath. Every summer, I waited for a message. Every birthday, I bought gifts I wasn't sure I'd ever be allowed to send. I remember one night, sitting on the edge of my bed with a tiny pink dress folded on my lap. It was for her second birthday. I picked it because my daughter loved butterflies when she was a child, and I thought, maybe her daughter would love them too. We mailed it. It was returned unopened. That was the night my husband cried for the first time. Not the kind of crying you wipe away quickly. No. He cried the way a man cries when the people he trusted most revealed they were never truly on his side. And I held him because what else can you do when your entire lineage is being pulled out of your hands by people who share your blood, but not your values? The second year, the year my daughter blamed herself. She watched my daughter fall apart quietly that year. She carried guilt like it was fused to her bones. She kept saying things like, I should have fought harder. I should have known they'd never give her back. I destroyed everything. She wasn't wrong about the destruction, but it wasn't hers. Her uncle held the match. Her grandmother poured the gasoline, and the rest of the family stood in a circle watching the fire they started while pretending their hands were clean. My daughter went to therapy. So did we. And still, there were days she couldn't get out of bed, days she couldn't look in the mirror, days she couldn't forgive herself for being 19 in a room full of adults who exploited her vulnerability. You know what's ironic? The people who stole her baby kept telling others she was unstable, emotional, dramatic, as if the pain they caused now belonged to her as another flaw. That's the cruelty of their story. They hurt her, then blamed her for hurting. The third year, the year we went no contact. We didn't plan it. We didn't sit down and announce it. It wasn't some dramatic explosion. It was a slow realization that every attempt, every olive branch, every carefully worded message was just another opportunity for them to twist the knife. We stopped calling, stopped checking in, stopped hoping they'd finally behave like human beings. And guess what? They never noticed. They never reached out. They never even asked why. Because people who destroy you rarely bother to look at the wreckage afterward. They walk away and expect you to sweep the pieces. The fourth year, the year my daughter saw her child again. The fourth visit. My daughter saved for months, worked overtime, canceled trips, cut back on expenses, lived frugally just to afford the flights and hotel. It was nearly $1,500 just to be allowed a few hours with her daughter. And even then, she was treated like an outsider, a guest, a distant relative with limited access. She showed me pictures afterwards, not because she wanted to, but because she needed me to see her child's face before she broke down completely. My granddaughter looked so much like my daughter at that age. The same cheeks, the same eyes, the same tiny hand gripping the side of her dress. I cried after she left. My husband did too. We didn't do it in front of her. We waited until the house was empty and then let ourselves ache. People think courage is loud, but sometimes courage is being quiet long enough for your child to feel safe falling apart in your arms. The fifth year, the year we learned how to live with the loss. They say time heals everything. That's a lie told by people who haven't lost something that mattered. Time doesn't heal, it teaches you how to live despite the wound. By the 5th year, we had learned how to function again. Not because the pain faded, but because you can't spend your entire life bleeding. My daughter stopped asking, why would they do this to me? Because she finally accepted the truth. Some people don't love you. They love control. My husband stopped defending his mother in his head, stopped remembering her as the grandmother he thought she'd be. He finally saw her as the person she'd shown us she was. I stopped trying to be the bridge, stopped forcing myself to fix the unfixable, stopped believing that family always deserves forgiveness. And yet, even in healing, there was a void, an empty space in every holiday photo, a missing laugh in every family dinner, a pair of shoes that should have been by the door, but never would be. We learned to live with it. We didn't learn to stop wishing it were different.
By the 5th year, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the same woman who had once thought that family meant unconditional support. I was wiser, sharper, and heavier with the knowledge that love and loyalty aren't always returned, even when you give them freely. My husband and I leaned on each other, more than we had in decades. We'd survived storms together before, but this betrayal tested the very foundation of our marriage. For years, I had trusted that my husband's love for me was unshakable, and it was. But even unshakable love can be stretched thin when someone you call family turns against your child. I watched my husband wrestle with guilt, anger, and disbelief. He had spent years believing his mother and brother were people of integrity. He had spent decades constructing a worldview where family always protects you. Watching him realize that those pillars were made of sand was almost as painful as watching my daughter lose her child. Meanwhile, my own grief deepened in quiet ways. Every time I saw my granddaughter's face in a photo, every time I held a toy meant for her, I felt the double sting of joy and impossibility. I wanted to pick her up, to cradle her like I had my own children, but the law and the cruelty of my in-laws had built a wall between us that no amount of tears could scale. I became hyper-aware of motherhood in ways I hadn't been before. I held my younger children closer, whispered encouragement more often, made sure they knew their worth in ways I feared my granddaughter could not. I had learned too late that words are fragile armor against the cruelty of others, but they are all we have sometimes. The breaking point came quietly, not with shouting or confrontation, but with a sense of resignation. I realized that my family had permanently fractured, that the people I thought would protect my daughter were the ones orchestrating her loss. And with that realization came a strange kind of clarity. I could not fix them. I could not force them to care, and I could not let their cruelty dictate the rest of my life. So I made a choice. I chose to reclaim control where I could, in my marriage, in my household, in my heart. I chose to nurture my own children, to protect them fiercely, and to stop giving my energy to people who had proven time and again that they did not deserve it. The weight of grief did not vanish, but it became manageable. It became fuel.
fuel to fight for my daughter, fuel to be a better parent to my younger children, fuel to demand respect from a world that sometimes values cruelty over kindness. I realized survival wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about proving my mother-in-law or brother-in-law wrong. Survival was about standing tall in the middle of devastation and teaching my children how to stand with me, even when the world is unkind. Every day, I reminded myself I had already lost enough, but I had not lost me. And that became the quiet mantra that carried me forward. After the breaking point, life demanded that I rebuild, not just my home or my routines, but the inner scaffolding of my heart. Loss had left gaping holes, but it also illuminated where strength had always been hiding. I began to see that survival wasn't merely endurance, it was a choice. A series of deliberate acts to reclaim dignity, joy, and control in a life that had been hijacked by the cruelty of others. I started small. Mornings became sacred, a space where I could center myself before the outside world intruded. I watched my younger children get ready for school, and I allowed myself to feel gratitude for their presence, their laughter, their stubborn little ways of reminding me that life moves forward even when your heart aches. I took stock of my relationships. I stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped explaining myself to people who had proven they could not be trusted. The family who had betrayed us were ghosts in our lives now. Their names still existed, but their influence did not. I redirected my energy towards those who truly mattered, my children, my husband, and the few friends who had shown steadfast loyalty. Rebuilding also meant confronting the financial and logistical pressures of maintaining family ties. Travel costs, gifts, and communication with my granddaughter had drained resources we didn't have, and so I chose to redirect those resources into creating a stable, nurturing environment for the children under my care. I invested in their education, their hobbies, their happiness, because the only influence I could guarantee was mine. Therapy became another cornerstone. Alone and together, we navigated the complicated layers of grief, guilt, and anger. It was not linear. Some days we would feel progress, others like the past had its claws sunk deep into our hearts. But therapy gave us a vocabulary for trauma, a framework for understanding betrayal, and a roadmap for reclaiming autonomy over our lives. I also began writing. Letters to my granddaughter I would never send, reflections on the events that had shattered our family, and insights into how trust is both precious and dangerous. Writing became a method of reclaiming narrative control. Where the family had attempted to define our story, I now had the power to tell it truthfully, with all the complexity, emotion, and depth it deserved. In these years of rebuilding, I discovered that resilience is not innate. It is cultivated. It is forged in the fires of heartbreak, in the quiet moments when you choose to love yourself and your children despite the forces aligned against you. And slowly, over months and years, the weight of betrayal became lighter, not because it disappeared, but because I had built a life strong enough to hold it without crumbling. I learned the hard truth. The people who hurt us will never apologize, and sometimes they will never even acknowledge the pain they caused. But we can choose how much power their cruelty has over the rest of our lives. By the end of this phase, we were still scarred, still wary, still aware of the fragility of trust. But we were alive, thriving, and learning to find joy despite everything we had lost.
Even after rebuilding, the shadow of betrayal lingered. It clung to the corners of my mind, whispering doubts, questioning decisions, and tempting me to replay every misstep over and over. Some days I could almost forget it, but it always returned, a quiet reminder that what we endured could never be erased. I had to learn to coexist with that shadow, not fight it directly. I realized that trying to get acknowledgement or an apology from those who had wronged us was futile. They would never understand, never admit guilt, never validate our grief. Holding on to the hope that they would change did nothing but fed anger and resentment. So I focused on what I could control: my life, my children, my home, and my emotional health. I created new traditions that excluded the toxic influences of the past. Birthdays, holidays, and family milestones became ours to shape, ours to celebrate authentically without the expectation of approval or interference from people who had proven themselves untrustworthy. I also embraced forgiveness, not for them, not for their actions, but for myself. I forgave my daughter for the decisions she made under pressure. I forgave my husband for the internal conflicts he wrestled with as he balanced loyalty to his family with love for us. And I forgave myself for the naivete, for trusting blindly, for believing that love alone could protect us. This forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean allowing access or influence over our lives. It meant release, the conscious act of removing the power of past betrayal from controlling my present or my future. Over time, peace began to grow. It was subtle at first: a quiet night where the house felt safe, a morning where I smiled before the world demanded my strength, a dinner where laughter wasn't overshadowed by tension or worry. My children thrived. My marriage endured. I discovered joy in moments I hadn't thought possible after years of grief. And slowly, the memory of loss shifted from a wound to a lesson. I learned that life doesn't always grant closure, that sometimes the best we can do is build boundaries, protect those we love, and cultivate resilience, that grief and love can coexist, that loss can become a catalyst for growth rather than a sentence to perpetual pain. Even as I looked back at the 5-year gap between my daughter and my granddaughter, I saw the resilience that had carried us through. I saw the lessons we had learned about trust, strength, and the importance of choosing carefully whom to let into your inner world. And I realized that, in a way, the betrayal that had broken us also revealed the depths of our capacity to endure, to protect, and to love. Peace didn't arrive in a flood. It arrived in small increments, in steady breathing, in laughter shared with children who needed me fully present, in love that wasn't conditional on the actions of others. And that peace became my shield, my foundation, my quiet triumph over the cruelty that had once seemed unstoppable. By the 7th year, I began to see the fruits of endurance. The pain was still there, but it no longer dictated my every thought. I had survived betrayal on a scale I never imagined possible. I had stood beside my daughter as she grieved a child taken from her, and I had learned the hardest truths about family, trust, and the fragility of human loyalty. Motherhood had become a lens through which I understood strength. I realized it wasn't measured by endurance alone. It was measured by the courage to rebuild when every instinct screamed to collapse. It was in showing my children that love is action, not just words. That even in the shadow of loss, you can nurture, protect, and flourish. I worked hard to instill resilience in my younger children, teaching them to value honesty, integrity, and kindness.
I encourage them to express their emotions without fear and to understand that family is defined by love and respect, not just blood or tradition. My daughter, though wounded, grew into her role as a mother with grace, determined to break the cycle of control and betrayal she had endured. I also began to reflect on the lessons for myself. I learned that trust must be earned, not assumed, that people's past behavior is the clearest predictor of future choices, that sometimes the only family you can fully rely on is the one you choose, the people who consistently show up, protect, and respect you. I found that sharing our story became a source of empowerment. Speaking the truth of our experience without shame or embellishment gave voice to the pain many endure silently. It allowed me to reclaim narrative authority from the people who tried to define our lives for us. And in that reclamation, I found peace. Not the fleeting kind that disappears with the next crisis, but the enduring kind, born from acceptance, action, and self-respect. I forgave, not for them, but for myself and my daughter. I let go of the weight of trying to change people who had already shown their true colors. Now, our legacy is different than what I once imagined. It's not defined by bloodlines or inherited privilege. It's defined by endurance, by courage, by the unwavering choice to protect and love those that matter most. It's in the moments we laugh without guilt, celebrate without fear, and teach our children to live honestly and bravely. I often think about my granddaughter, the child who was taken yet never forgotten. And I know that when the day comes for her to understand the story fully, she will learn not just of betrayal and pain, but of the resilience, love, and lessons that carried her mother, her family, and me through the impossible. The past shaped us, yes, but it does not define us. We define ourselves through our choices, our strength, and the love we give despite every obstacle. That, I believe, is the true measure of motherhood. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Stories like these aren't easy to hear, and they're even harder to live, but they teach us something invaluable: resilience, the strength of motherhood, and the power of choosing whom we allow into our lives. Here on this channel, we explore the real, the raw, and the human, the experiences that leave marks, but also teach lessons. Every story you hear is about navigating life's most challenging moments, finding strength when it feels impossible, and learning how to thrive despite betrayal, loss, and heartache. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. I want to hear from those who take the time to tune in and share these moments with us. And remember, the people who hurt us do not define our lives. How we rise from the pain does. Keep choosing strength, keep choosing love, keep choosing yourself. If you want more stories of resilience, hope, and life lessons told through the lens of real human experiences, subscribe and join this journey. Every story here is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's a way to reclaim your power and live fully.